Hello, comrades. So, the academic agent actually made a response. First of all, I don't really approve of how you dealt with the whole Mussolini question, because in my original video I said that it seems that you don't know that Mussolini didn't write the Fascist Manifesto. It was written by other people before his time, and it was not any kind of statement of principles of his government, and he also didn't really follow the proposals of that document. You cut out the last part, where I said that his government didn't follow those proposals. You cut that out, and instead you just said that what does it matter that it wasn't written by him? Well, people keep bringing that up because it makes you look like a fucking idiot. That's why, because it was sort of crucial to your argument. You were saying how, oh look how Mussolini is saying all these quasi-social democratic things, but the catch is, it wasn't Mussolini who said that, so it kind of makes you look like an idiot, and it kind of destroys your argument. My other big gripe with your video is that you addressed almost none of my points. That was like, the Mussolini point was like the only one that you addressed. In your original video, you claimed that you had all these similarities between fascism and socialism. I debunked every single one of them, and you didn't refute any of them in any way whatsoever. You ignored all of that. I don't need to repeat myself here, you can just go and see my original video if you want, but basically like he claimed fascism and socialism are similar because he said that they both have like large militaries, and then I pointed out how ridiculous that is considering the United States has the biggest military in the world, and stuff like that. The things he said that were similarities between fascism and socialism were really not. Fascism has more in common with just ordinary capitalism than socialism, but the academic agent unfortunately didn't feel the need to address any of those arguments. I'm guessing because he can't. Basically, he made the Mussolini argument. He kind of misquoted me to sort of deal with the Mussolini argument, and to me that still didn't really work. The other things he said in his video, he called me a Holocaust denier, for one thing. I don't really know what to say to that. But basically he said that because I think the Soviet Union was good even though they killed people, that makes me a Holocaust denier. Now of course that's a non sequitur because I'd never said the Soviet Union never killed anybody. Basically he totally misunderstood my point, or I mean I don't even think he actually misunderstood it. I think he just is using these dishonest tactics and like not dealing with any of my arguments, then just resorting to calling me names because he has no argument. But basically the point that I was making in my original video was that basically, the academic agent thought that the Soviet Union and Nazi Germany were similar because they both were relatively authoritarian to their enemies. But I wanted to demonstrate how that doesn't really make any sense because the United States, for example, also cracked down on communism. Does that make them fascist?
We are living in an era marked by the growth of socialism, its basic godless philosophy.
Lying, dirty,
its goal of world conquest,
shrewd, godless,
its insidious tactics,
murderous, determined.
and its cunning strategy.
It's an international criminal conspiracy.
The main difference is that the Soviet Union had a socialist system, and they cracked down on right-wingers and capitalists and fascists, whereas Nazi Germany had a capitalist economic system and a profit-driven economic system, and they cracked down on leftists, communists, democratic forces, and ethnic minorities. He turned around and said, do you really think the Soviet Union only repressed capitalists and right-wingers and not workers? And my answer to that would be predominantly yes. If you were a capitalist, then you were worse off than if you were a worker. I don't know what kind of image he has of the Soviet Union, but, you know, it wasn't this hellish nightmare. You know, just let me read something by John Scott. He was an American worker, an American engineer who worked in the Soviet Union in 1936 to 38, I think. In the mid to late 30s anyway. And he said that, he's talking about the purge that happened in the 30s. Quote, the purge caused many arrests, but the Soviet Union was large, and millions of Russians who had not been involved personally in the purge took it more or less as it came without allowing it to permanently influence their attitude towards the Soviet power. So that, in the end of 1938, when the purge ended, when hundreds of arrested people were released, with terse apologies for mistakes of their investigators, when new arrests stopped or almost stopped, most of the workers in Magnitogorsk had an essentially cheerful and optimistic view of things. End of quote. So Magnitogorsk was the big steel complex that he worked in. And yeah, in the 30s, it was basically the aftermath of the revolution. They were hunting down internal enemies, whether they be right-wingers, members of the capitalist class who were stripped of their power, but they were now trying to work in different ways to restore the capitalist order, fascist sympathizers who were hoping that Hitler would attack the Soviet Union and they could then go back to capitalism, or even left oppositionists. The Purge was the most violent event in Soviet peacetime history, basically. And for some reason, anti-communists, they think that because they had this purge, therefore everything they did was bad, or something. They have such leniency when it comes to capitalist regimes, like when the United States has slavery and kills off all the indigenous people and invades every conceivable country they possibly can, when the UK uses genocidal colonialism and kills millions of people around the world, even in Ireland, these people, like Academic Agent, they're fine. They don't really care. They think capitalism is still just fine.
March 16, 1968, the Charlie Company, commanded by Lieutenant William Calley, marched into hamlet of My Lai 4, also known as Pinkville. Lieutenant Calley and his troops were ordered to search and destroy. Lieutenant Superior Captain Medina said, "No civilians are innocent. Enemy is enemy." This was the perfect opportunity to seek revenge against the Viet Cong. Around 7:40 a.m., the Charlie Company killed about 300 to 500 innocent civilians. This deadly horrific event was known as My Lai massacre. Majority of the victims were women, young children, babies, and the elderlies.
Casually going through them, you went into villages, started ripping shit apart. That became the standard now.
Many women and young children were raped by multiple American soldiers, sodomized and mutilated before they were all shot down with machine guns. Bodies had C Company carved into their chest, and groups of people were pushed and shoved into ditches waiting to be killed.
There's 10 million people who starve to death in capitalism every single year, but they think that's not a problem. Sure, they might not approve of that, but they don't ever bring it up. They don't ever complain about that. They don't feel like they must do something to stop such an atrocity, such an ongoing, horrible catastrophe. Instead, they think capitalism is just fine, but when the Soviet Union kills internal enemies in the aftermath of the revolution, that's to them just unacceptable. That's the worst thing that has ever happened in human history. But if you get a little perspective on that, the Purge didn't affect more than a fraction of the population, and they had a fascist fifth column in the country, like the UK did, and France did, and Czechoslovakia did, and even Finland had a fascist fifth column. Now, the Soviet Union was more harsh towards the fascist fifth column. I don't remember what the Americans did to their fascist fifth column. In France, of course, the fascist fifth column was not crushed. It actually came to power. Same in Czechoslovakia. But the Soviet Union was more vulnerable to this kind of thing, which is why they used more force against it. I don't have time in this video to go into all this in detail, but not everything is equivalent to the Holocaust. Everybody can play this game. Like, I could say if you support capitalism, you're a Holocaust denier because 10 million people starve in capitalism every single year, or because the US kills millions, or the UK kills millions, France kills millions. If you don't actively denounce them at all times, then, like, are you a Holocaust denier? Is that really a fair comparison? You even made, like, Pinochet jokes in your own video. Are you a Holocaust denier for that? Oh, I almost forgot. He told me to read Solzhenitsyn. That was funny. Couple things about that. Solzhenitsyn, like, of course he's a notorious liar and he's been, like, debunked and everything. And he's an anti-Semite and a crypto-fascist and, like, honestly, you shouldn't take him seriously. But, even if he was a man of great reputation, whatnot, it's still a totally anecdotal thing that he's saying. He's like, oh, I personally suffered at the hands of the Soviet government, therefore it's bad. That's anecdotal at best. His books, like, I'm gonna link to a blog post that I have written some time ago. It's called The Gulag Archipelago Shouldn't Be Taken Seriously. And I know now the academic agent is just gonna jump around in joyous rapture and call me a Holocaust denier again, but whatever. The Gulag Archipelago is this book that Solzhenitsyn has written, which it is not a history book, it's a fictional book. Like, it is a work of fiction. It is a pseudo-historical fiction novel, but the Americans, for like, God knows what reason, they treat it like a historical, like a work of history, you know, a history book. They treat it as an authoritative depiction of the Stalin-era Soviet prison system. Whatever, the Soviet Union even abolished said prison system. The Soviet Union abolished the Gulag system in the 50s because they abolished penal labor together with when European countries, most European countries abolished penal labor. Ironically, the United States has not abolished penal labor. But anyway, well, really the big problem with the Gulag system was not that they had penal labor, it was the bad conditions. It was a poor country where prison conditions were bad, so therefore you had a mortality of like 3 to 5% among the prisoners. Think about it as a third world country. That's what it was in the 1930s. Life wasn't so great in the British labor colonies either. Like Oscar Wilde, for example, he basically died as a result of a 2-year sentence. Only 2 years in a British labor prison because he was sent there because he was gay. He died almost immediately after he got out because of the illness and weakness, bad conditions. Of course, the Soviet Union had many of the same problems. But this is from a 2003 New York Times article where it talks about Solzhenitsyn's wife. It says, quote, in her 1974 memoir, Sanya, My Life with Alexander Solzhenitsyn, she wrote that she was, quote-unquote, perplexed that the West had accepted the Gulag Archipelago as the solemn ultimate truth, saying its significance has been, quote-unquote, overstated and wrongly appraised. She said that her husband did not regard the work as historical research or scientific research. I repeat, it has fictional characters in it. It is by no means a historical work. It is a book that was spread far and wide during the Cold War by the West for propaganda reasons to slander the Soviet Union. And not even the Soviet Union so much because it focuses on the Stalin era, but communism in general. Many aspects of Solzhenitsyn's work have been debunked, whereas the rest of it is simply unproven. Just because he claims something without evidence doesn't mean it's true. He was not a reliable guy. He was an anti-Semite, pro-fascist, vicious anti-communist. He's like the most unreliable witness ever. Just to give you kind of an idea of what kind of guy we're talking about. He supported the Vietnam War. He opposed democracy. He thought democracy was a bad idea. He thought communism was a result of a hostile foreign culture being imposed on Russia. So it's very similar to the whole Jewish conspiracy. That Bolshevism is like a Jewish conspiracy imposed on white Russia. He wanted a orthodox Christian, clerical fascist almost, pan-Slavic state. He also supported fascist Franco. He supported Pinochet as well. He was put in prison in the Soviet Union for, I think it was 6 years, for spreading anti-Soviet propaganda and pro-Nazi views. That's what the Soviets said, pro-Nazi views. He says that 60 million people died in those prisons. Well, he didn't die. The conditions were probably bad. I can believe that. It was like 1940s. Post-war, everything was poor. I'm sure the conditions were bad. But to say that he's just like an innocent victim of tyranny who just loved democracy, that's bullshit. He supported far-right dictatorships. He was a fascist sympathizer. Supported Franco, who would later support Pinochet. Maybe you should look into Solzhenitsyn a bit more carefully before you actually trust what he's saying. He's not a reliable guy whatsoever. I've met so many idiots who have told me to read Solzhenitsyn. They're like, oh, read Solzhenitsyn. Read the Black Book of Communism. Oh, the Black Book of Communism. That sounds highly objective. Like, Solzhenitsyn is the guy who said that 60 million people died in the Soviet prison system. 60 million. That's half the population of the country. How is that possible? Like, oh yeah, half the population is in prison, and they all died. And then, what is the other half doing? Probably guarding the other half. Like, when the Soviet Union collapsed, and the Western researchers had access to the archives of the Soviet Union, at first they didn't believe how high the population was. They were like, what? If 10, 20, or 60 million had died, shouldn't the population be like wicked low? But no, there's not even the population didn't even decrease at any point. It did decrease during the war, of course, but at any point in peacetime it didn't decrease. So, like, you really trust Solzhenitsyn, the guy who said that the Soviets killed half their population? I don't know, I just think it's a cop-out answer to say like, oh, you're just a Holocaust denier. He literally said that if you think the Soviet Union was just hunky-dory, then you're a Holocaust denier, but that's just preposterous. Like, are the majority of Russians also Holocaust deniers because they thought their life in the Soviet Union was just fine, you know? Are they Holocaust deniers? That's ridiculous. Like, that's just his crazy anti-communist bias speaking. Now, before I move on to my last point, I want to talk about the definition of socialism because he had a problem with that. Basically, the academic agent, he said that Marxists, that we think we have like a monopoly on what it means to be socialist, and that is quite funny in the light of his last point, but that is not the case. There are other kinds of socialism besides Marxism. Let me give you a few examples. There's the French utopian socialists and other utopian socialists who were before Marx, so all the pre-Marxian socialism. Whatever popular socialism has existed besides Marxism, like the Russian Narodnik socialism that competed with Marxism in Russia, liberation theology. Liberation theology, I suppose some of those people who advocated it were influenced by Marxism, but others were not. Anarchist socialism is not Marxist. Some anarchists partially agree with some aspects of Marxism, but typically anarchists and Marxists are always debating with each other. There's other kinds of socialism within Marxism itself, other than just Marxism-leninism that I advocate. There's Trotsky's socialism, there's left communist socialism, libertarian socialism, there's even market socialism, whatever. There's plenty of different kinds of socialism, but basically what he argues, he claims that like the Labour Party is socialist, and this is all building up to his last point, which I will get to, but basically he said that like the Labour Party is socialist, that Keynes was a socialist. No, no. There's a reason why we don't think social democrats are socialists. Granted, it is somewhat complicated because like 100 years ago, literally 100 years ago, in the early 1900s, late 1800s, Marxists used to call themselves social democrats, alright? So there was the Russian Social Democratic Labour Party, there was the Finnish Social Democratic Party. Those people were typically Marxists. But by the 1920s, a split had come about. A split where the revolutionaries had split with the reformists. For example, there was a revolution in Finland, a communist revolution, and after the revolution failed and was crushed by the capitalist government, they killed, exterminated most of the revolutionaries, and they allowed most right-wing reformists to actually take over the Social Democrat Party. Meanwhile, in Russia, the Russian communists, they changed their name from the Social Democratic Party to the Communist Party because they thought that that was more in line with, what their party's name should be, and in order to distance themselves from Social Democrats who they thought had betrayed the movement, who were reformists. I'm not going to go into great detail, but basically that is the root of where this divide came from. In the course of the following decades, there existed revolutionary Marxism alongside reformist social democracy, which was openly reformist. They said, let's not have a revolution, let's just work within the context of the capitalist system and improve lives of the workers. In the 1960s, 1970s, 1980s, depending somewhat on the party, all social democrats pretty much dropped socialism from their party program. Like, for instance, I think the Finnish Social Democrat Party dropped socialism from their program in the 80s, even though it was quite evident long before that they were not socialists. They were not actually working for socialism. What social democrats do, instead of going for socialism, they actually just want to reform capitalism. They want a happier capitalism. They want a capitalism with higher wages for the workers, with better health care. They don't want to overthrow capitalism and replace it with another system. Instead, they just want to improve the current capitalist system. That is why we don't consider them socialists. Now, another element of this confusion is that a lot of Americans and a lot of Western people simply don't know what socialism means. Like, Finnish people have a pretty good grasp on what it means, I've noticed. Finnish people know what socialism is. Like, you ask a Finn, what do you think about socialism? And he's like, oh, you mean that thing that existed in the Soviet Union? I'm like, yeah. But the situation is very different when you go and speak to an American. Americans think that Bernie Sanders is like some hardcore socialist. They think that socialism is when the government does stuff, and that communism is what the Soviet Union had. The Soviet Union was socialist. It was always working towards communism. They said, oh, if we achieve all these great goals and we produce this much and we develop this much, then we'll reach communism. That's what they said. The Union of Soviet Socialist Republics was socialist, not communist. The ideology was communism, but the economic system was not communist. It was socialist. What is the definition of socialism? Common ownership of the means of productions, and I would also add to that socialism has to have a planned economy, but there's some socialists who don't like planning. What is capitalism? Capitalism is a mode of production where they have a private ownership of the means of productions, and products are made to be sold on the market for profit. To me, that's a pretty fair definition of what capitalism is. Of course, libertarians and classical liberals, whatnot, people like the academic agent, they probably want to define capitalism as something vague and nebulous, like free trade or something. But there's always been free trade. Usually in their examples when they talk about, like, you give me a sandwich, I give you a bottle of beer, that's capitalism. Like, that's not even free trade, that's barter. That doesn't even involve money. But honestly, like, libertarians should realize that capitalism is more than anything a mode of production, not a mode of trade. The capitalist mode of production is totally different from any other mode of production. But the mode of trade is only somewhat different. In capitalism, you have this developed world market and you use money and stuff like that. Whereas in feudalism and previous systems, the use of money was much less, trade was not nearly as developed. Most products were made for direct personal use or direct personal consumption rather than for trade, for the market. But still, there's always been markets in the world, even before capitalism. So just to define capitalism as free trade or something, that's too vague, that doesn't explain anything. Then, the academic agent makes his last point. For that, he has a source, and it's Mises.org. You couldn't write this stuff. Like, that's like if I said all this stuff and then my only source was like, Stalin was a good Christian who did nothing wrong.org. And then I was like, hey, I have a source. You must believe me now. What this Mises article and what the academic agent then claims is that everything is socialist. Everything. Keynes was a massive commie. UK, USA, communist countries, not capitalist, not real capitalism. To me, it's so funny, like, when he said that, you Marxists just want to have a strict monopoly in what you consider socialism. Like, says the guy who thinks that literally nothing is capitalist except this crazy utopia he has in his head. Like, I'm perfectly willing to admit that there's other kinds of socialism, not just Marxist-Leninist kind of socialism, not even just Marxist socialism. I just don't agree that, like, Bernie Sanders is a socialist. But the academic agent thinks that nothing is capitalist. Except, like, if you go back to the classical good old days of laissez-faire, then you have capitalism. Oh, alright, so unless, like, if you ban child labor, not capitalism. If you ban actual slavery, not capitalism. Only when you have good old laissez-faire with child labor, slavery, massive poverty, illiteracy, life expectancy is 30 years, colonialism, only then you have real capitalism. Well, I tend to agree. People have an overtly rosy image of capitalism nowadays in the West because they think that Keynesianism represents real capitalism. Keynesianism is a happy capitalism. Real capitalism is vicious. Child labor, slavery, horrible oppression, poverty, the way that capitalism is in most countries. Go to Bangladesh, go to India, go to Africa, go to most places on this planet. You'll see what capitalism is really like. They don't have any Keynesianism over there. They don't have much capitalism with a human face in Nepal. No. You work 12 hours a day for a meager wage. If you try to unionize, they'll beat you up or kill you or imprison you. They might torture you in prison, as happens to union organizers in India. My bad. The academic agent thinks that India is a socialist country. Like, who's being utopian now? He's such a utopian, he doesn't think capitalism has, like, properly existed in, like, allow me to explain to you, academic agent, why we are at this point in where we are right now, alright? So, if you think you can just go back to classical, colonial, laissez-faire or whatnot, when everything was the way it was supposed to be, when the poor were fucking starving, even in London, and when the sun never set in the British Empire. If you think you can go back to that, you can't. And the reason is that capitalist competition itself has an inherent tendency towards centralization of property and increased monopolization. In the course of competition, there's small businesses, they compete, some of them become successful, they grow bigger, the majority of them go bankrupt. Then you have bigger corporations. Those bigger corporations compete, some of them are successful and grow even bigger. And in the course of time, you will have these really big companies. As competition proceeds, money starts to centralize into fewer and fewer hands, more and more. The wealthier and bigger these corporations get, the more advantages in competition they have. And also, the other side of the argument is that they start to be able to more and more influence politics. Now, of course, capitalists always had some influence, like, before industrial capitalists and bankers were the main people running the government, it used to be the feudal aristocracy. And of course, a lot of the feudal aristocracy themselves started to invest in capitalist enterprises themselves and became capitalists themselves. But basically, the academic agent says, if the government does anything, then it's socialist. That is a ridiculous argument. It doesn't take the economic system or the mode of production into account in any way whatsoever. He just thinks if the government does stuff, if the government regulates stuff, then it's socialist. Well, comrades, we have won. We have world socialism. Even the US is socialist. Oh man. It was so easy, we barely had to do anything. No, the fact that the capitalists influence the government and that the government regulates things, that is an inherent part of capitalism. Of course, there's different tendencies competing in capitalism, like some of them, they try to tax the rich a bit more, some of them try to tax them less. Compare Keynesianism versus neoliberal capitalism. But while the academic agent accuses me of having a monopoly, like, oh, if it's not Marxism-leninism, then it's not socialist. Of course it is. Like, there's anarchist socialism, there's Trotskyist socialism, you know, whatever, there's pre-Marxian utopian socialism. But to him, if it's not laissez-faire, it's not capitalist. Fascism, even though it has a capitalist economic system, doesn't count. Keynesianism, even though it has a capitalist economic system, doesn't count. Neoliberalism, even though it has a capitalist economic system, doesn't count. Only laissez-faire counts. Well, when you are at this stage where you have international monopoly capitalism, how do you go back? Like, international monopoly capitalism didn't develop because some evil government bureaucrat just decided, let's have international monopoly capitalism. Let's make it happen, boys. And then they did. No. Capitalism has developed over centuries, and this is what it has become. This was the inevitable outcome of capitalist laws, capitalist market, and the capitalist mode of production. You want to try to undo that? Well, how exactly? You're gonna take the money of the ultra-rich and you're gonna split it into smaller piles and say, alright, let's have individual factory owners again. Let's not have this one guy own 1,000 factories around the world. Let's just have it so that one capitalist owns one factory in one town. And then we can have them compete again like in the good old days. How on earth do you think you're gonna make that happen? That's the biggest redistribution of wealth I've ever heard. And even if you did that, even if you put us back to square one of capitalism, how are you gonna stop it from going back to monopoly? If there's a company that just happens to be successful in competition, it's gonna get bigger and bigger and bigger, and it's gonna grab a bigger share of the market. Sooner or later, it's gonna have like a quarter or 30% or 50% or even 70% of the market to itself. And then we're talking monopoly capitalism. There's no way of preventing that. Even if you make a law that says you can only control like 2% of the market, otherwise the state will kill you, like, that would not be free trade, that would be massive state intervention. I thought that your response was rather poor because you didn't address almost any of my points. You just misquoted me on Mussolini, called me a Holocaust denier, and then said that everything is socialist.